Welcome to the Karma Leaders Podcast. Author Dr. Tom McDougall explores the concepts of the groundbreaking leadership book, Karma Doesn't Need My Help, 11 weekly lessons to leadership success and peace. Now, let's jump into the episode.
Welcome to the Karma Leaders Podcast. This is a podcast based off of the book that was published earlier this year. It is Karma Doesn't Need My Help, 11 weekly lessons for leadership success and peace, really focused on the healthcare industry. And today I've got a special guest, hopefully a very regular guest, Paul Theriot. Paul is currently the CEO at Birmingham Gastroenterology, a very large, successful gastroenterology group in Alabama. And he has well over 20 years of hospital management experience in addition to that. And Paul is a very insightful, intelligent, almost ethereal individual that he and I enjoy kicking around ideas and concepts and telling stories. And so I'm honored that you joined me today, Paul.
Listen, man, no, I'm honored to be on. Thanks so much.
Well, good. Well, if you've listened to the podcast episodes, then you realize most of the time we kind of tackle a topic or a paragraph or a sentence in the book and then go deep dive on that. Today, we're going to do something a little bit different, which is talk about a concept that is kind of touched on multiple times through the book. And that is this concept that I personally struggle with for the 23 years that I was a hospital CEO. And it's this obligation that you have to be on stage all the time. Whether you are in the organization or out of the organization, you are always the leader of that organization. And I really struggle with that because it conflicted with my personal need, which was to not only serve in a role for which I was given a title, but also to be a real person. And so I always struggled with, how do I balance being a real person? How do I just balance being myself, being Tom McDougall, and being the CEO of the organization? And I admit, I never really figured it out completely. But that's something that I kind of struggle with. I mentioned it to Paul, and I think Paul has some thoughts on it also.
So early in my career, I was, I guess you could say I was getting a late start. I had transitioned from another career different than the healthcare administration, and I felt like, well, listen, I've got some accomplishments I get caught up on, and so there was some pressure I put on myself, and that sort of translated into well, listen, I'll make relationships later. I got to get this stuff done. I'll buy all the beers later, kind of a thing. And that, luckily, I got some good advice along the way. It said, look, these relationships are going to help you get those accomplishments. And so I thankfully had absorbed that and began to start developing those relationships. And I would say, I don't want to say the pendulum went the other way, but I found myself in situations where I had developed what I felt like was a really good sort of rapport with a given employee or a given manager. And then, well, there was a specific situation, I'll just kind of keep it generic, but I needed to have a critical conversation with that manager and sit them down and kind of give them some accountability. And that did not go well because they were like, kind of, again, to paraphrase, I thought you were my friend. I can't believe you would feel this way. And it's like, well, no, this is, you know, so I found myself, I was like, there is a line. And maybe I went a little too far with being the buddy buddy thing. And I got to say, I haven't quite figured that out. I think right now, what my goal is to sort of recruit and bring people on my team who really understand. Listen, I want to, I'm going to, I want to be a manager that understands all your needs, personal and professional. But at the end of the day, we all have jobs to do, and that's, a lot of people get it. It's not terribly hard to find people, but you gotta sort of feel that out, because there are some people that will that there's a gap there. They don't really understand that, just because we're friends and we might, you know, go hang out somewhere, um, doesn't mean I can't hold you accountable. And that's a difficult balance.
Middle of my career, I recruited and hired a chief operating officer at the organization where I was. So I was CEO, he was COO. and just a super likable, capable leader. And he and I did bond. We got to know each other real well. Same thing you're describing. We go to lunch sometimes. We would hang out, sometimes after hours, take our wives to dinner together. And we just had a lot in common and got along really well. And fast forward a number of months, and we were having a conversation one day, and I was having to hold him accountable because something we had agreed he was going to do had not worked out very well. And it wasn't necessarily his fault. It was more of a, I'm holding you accountable to get this fixed, type conversation. And he said something. He said, well, it didn't go the way, and I'm paraphrasing. He said, it didn't go the way I wanted it to go, but, we're friends. So you and I can figure this out together. And we kind of solved the problem. Well, I started thinking about that comment. I didn't say anything to him, but I thought, huh, all right, where does this fall in my responsibility and accountability as the CEO of the organization? Which, a company's paying me in that role. So I've got a responsibility to that first. And so a number of weeks later, he said something similar, and I stopped him. And we were sitting in my office, door closed, nobody else around. And I said, hey man, I said, we gotta have a conversation about that because this is the second time you've said that to me. And it's a risk of hurting your feelings. I'm going to say this, but we aren't friends. I said, I am paid by the organization to be the CEO. You are paid by the organization to be the COO. The reason we work together is they have hired and kept both of us. But we aren't friends. And I said, I do hope one day we will be friends when we're not working together, but
Yeah.
we are not friends now. We are work colleagues. And he didn't take it real well.
Yeah.
It stopped him in his tracks. He shifted a lot. He was kind of uncomfortable. I noticed he acted funny to me for a few days, but then everything kind of settled back down. Well, anyway, fast forward about 5 years from that conversation, and he was the CEO of his own organization. I was CEO of another organization. Um, and and he and I were talking one day, and he said, "Hey, you remember saying that to me?" And I said, "Yeah, I do." I said, "I do remember that." And he said, "I do too." He said, "At first, it hurt my feelings." He said, "But now I get it." And I
Yeah.
said, "Really?" And he said, "Yes." He said, "I didn't say the exact same thing to one of my coworkers the other day, but I was close. It was right along the same lines." He
Yeah.
said, "Thank you for saying that to me that day, even though I didn't take it very well." And and I thought, it's interesting because we've got that responsibility to build these close relationships. That's where success comes from, is having close, trusted relationships. But keeping that line drawn is kind of tough. Now, interestingly enough, that story was when I said that to him was probably either in 2007 or 2008. Here we are in 2026. We are friends. And I talk to him at least every couple of months. We still play fantasy football together, and he's a great guy. He was a great guy then, he's a great guy now. But we're friends now, but we weren't friends at the time, and we couldn't be friends in those roles.
Well, and then I don't want to get into the semantics of what we're talking about, but I think you just touched on something, and that it reminds me of I was prepping for some mission work, and I was working with this guy from Africa, and we were having a conversation, and I just mentioned, I said, I think I said, well, listen, friend, man, we're going to make this work. And he stopped me and he said, why do you call me friend? And I said, it's just, I don't know what that means in African, but that I'm just kind of, uh, you know, being nice. And well, let me tell you, in Africa, you are lucky if in your lifetime you have one friend. So it's this designation for someone that they hold in very high esteem. And it just highlights that we all define friend differently. And I bet there are people that would listen to the comments you just made and say, no, 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 no. You're wrong, Tom. You can have friends at work. You can have friends that report to you. But I think what's important is what you're getting at, which is how is that personal and professional relationship balanced in such a way that yes, we're going to go have a beer and we'll talk about baseball. But when we're at work, we both have jobs to do, and those jobs are really relying upon this accountability structure. I'm accountable to the board members, you're accountable to me. And we all have to get the work done. And man, I haven't figured it out. I am just, it is, but I think every situation has its own dynamic, and you just got to feel that person out. And I think it requires us to sort of define that again. What does friend mean? Because I could understand why he might be offended by you saying we're not friends, and that some people would immediately say, well, we're not enemy. Are we enemies now? No, that doesn't mean we're not coworkers. It doesn't mean we have an adversarial relationship. It's just we're not in this category as friends. We are coworkers first. I'm probably not making a whole lot of sense, but I think it's an
I
important
think it
topic.
makes great sense because maybe we use the word too loosely.
Yeah, I think so.
And I think that's a real valid point because I do agree with you can have work friends. Um, and I actually came up with a phrase a while back, and it is in the book, but I refer to transactional friends. Um, because when you're a leader of an organization, you have lots of friends using this loose word. You do. You got lots of friends. But it's always been very interesting to me that if you fast forward from leaving that organization and add a couple of years, who of those friends are still around? Because, if you're the CEO of the organization or administrator or COO or CNO or even a department director with your team, there are a lot of people that like you. And the reason they like you is because you can do things for them. You can.
Yes,
And
you're gonna
so those
agree with me.
relationships, and that's where I came up with the transactional friends term, because you are friends because of the potential or hope for a transaction, for you to give them something they want or need. Um, but the transactional friends are very different from your true friends. The true friends like you because of who you are, not because of what you're going to give them. And it's always been very curious to me because I figured this out kind of later in my career. And every once in a while, it would pop in my head. I'd be like, I don't know if this is a transactional friend or a real friend. I'm not really sure. So I'd keep my guard up to some extent. But the only way to figure out who's a transactional friend versus a real friend is to leave the organization. Because when you leave that organization, then you can no longer provide a transactional exchange for that person. And they're not necessarily your friend. Maybe they still are at some level, but they're not as close a friend as you perceived. And some of it, I'll be honest, there's some people who've disappointed me over the years where I thought I had developed a true friendship with that person. And now looking back, it was a transactional friendship. They really, were not interested in me as a person. They were very interested in me because of the role that I was in.
Well, and
But
I want to take that and turn it inward because I will say, as you're talking, I'm thinking of people that I actually did what you're describing, and it was I treated them as transactional friends, and it's a big regret. I'm like I haven't stayed in touch with that particular director or manager or whatever, and it's like they trusted me, and I did not really honor that relationship. And I think as leaders, if you're going to go there, you've got to honor that. I mean, and we feed it as much as we get fed from those types of things.
it's a great point though, because I'm sure I've done it as well, where I've because there's a lot of people I haven't kept in touch with it. Some of it's bandwidth. I mean,
Yeah,
if
sure. Yeah, we
you
work with a
develop,
lot of people.
yeah, you work with a ton of people over the years, and the number that you still keep in touch with on a regular basis is probably very small.
Yeah,
Uh,
well, and that
just
just
because
means
you're
that
incapable, you can't keep up with, you know, 40, 50 people on a regular basis. You just can't do it, much less thousands.
yeah, so the big question is, well, so do you go there? And it's hard because we tend to be transit in these roles. We don't, 3 to 5 years is our general lifespan. We don't stick around long, but for those lucky few that are in a role for 10 plus years, man, they've got great stories and super solid relationships with their team, and I can only be envious of that. And so, like I said, I'm still figuring it out, but the one thing I try to do is whatever relationship is developed, I want to honor whatever level it is, but at the same time accomplish what the organization has asked me to do. And it's difficult, man. It's a there's an art to it for sure, and I'm still
Yeah.
figuring it out.
Well, I think we all are, and we'll probably continue to figure it out for the rest of our careers, if not lives.
Right.
Um,
That's right.
all right, so I want to get your take on something because my wife and I've been married for, I think June will be 33 years. Hopefully, she doesn't hear this and say I'm wrong, but I think we're coming up on the 33rd anniversary. But my wife
Want to
is
get
a
a
nurse.
calculator?
Yeah, I mean, just think about it. Let's see, got married in 93. Yeah, it'll be 33 years. I'm right.
There you go.
Um, okay, so she was a nurse in an organization where I was the CEO, and I argued with her being hired. The CNO, my CNO, argued back with me because they really wanted her to work there. And HR said it was fine. And I was like, all right, whatever. But the day it becomes a problem, this experiment's over. So it was that type conversation. But anyway, so she was working as a nurse in one of our procedure areas at the hospital. She's just doing PRN. But I had, and we tried our best not to have shop talk at home. We just didn't. Now, occasionally something would come up, but not very commonly. But recently, she called me out on something I said years and years and years ago. I mean, like recently, like last week, standing in our kitchen. Okay, so what? I know you're laughing because you've been married a long time, like me. But anyway, so she brought up something I had said when we both were working for that organization because I was working on really increasing the case volume in that department. And I had several initiatives. She knew about those initiatives, partially because she worked there and partially because I talked to her about it. But it was going to be significant. It was like a lot of volume that we were going to bring in. And one night, at the time, hey, she said, I got to ask you a question. How do you think our department can handle all this additional volume? And my response was quick and it was also short. I said, I know you can handle it. Okay. So she didn't have a whole lot to say at that moment, but last week she had a lot to say about it.
I was
And
going to say that.
well, it has caused me to pause, and I'm still processing this, but I want your input because my intent, and I remember saying it, my intent was to communicate trust and confidence in the team, that they were that good, that I trusted them, that they could handle this ramp up in volume. What she heard, and she told me this last week, what she heard is that I didn't have a plan. I wasn't concerned. And all I cared about was the money that was going to come from that additional volume. That's what she heard. And I'm like, whoa, that hurt. Okay. Um, that one hurts. Here's my question for you though. In those situations, when you do, it doesn't necessarily have to be your wife. It can be somebody that you work with that, is a trusted relationship. It's a work relationship and you rely on each other because that relationship exists. When somebody expresses concern along those lines, what's the right way to respond?
Yeah.
Is it to provide a paragraph answer that instills trust and offers a solution? Or I don't know. I'm still struggling with this. So I blew it years ago. So how do I not blow it again in the future?
So I want to first, let's take the spousal dynamic out of the equation and just imagine that
Good
this
call.
was during it. Yeah. But I think the time of day you had this conversation was important because you're probably like, I'm done with the day. Um, was this in the evening? You
It
guys are
was. Yep.
dinner time.
I think we were
Okay.
cooking dinner together is when we were having a conversation. Okay. Cooking dinner together is when we were having a conversation. Okay.
Okay.
Having a conversation.
So All right, so I'm going to use this as an example of a time when you don't have time to do the explanation and the grand dissertation about my strategy of how I'm going to accomplish this. And we've all had those situations where it's like, you're going to just have to trust me, this is the right decision. And I have been burned so many times with trying to skip over that buy-in step of, well, let me help you understand why we're doing what we're doing. And it takes a lot of energy. It takes you to stop, be in the moment, and I'm taking the spousal thing out of it, just imagining I'm in the hallway, because the instances where I've done this are always in a hallway conversation. You're walking through from one unit to the next. A manager stops you and says essentially what you just articulated, which is, "Hey, I heard we've got this new line coming on board. How are we going to handle that?" And generally, the answer is going to be, "We'll be fine." And you just keep walking. And it's this inherent, I'm the CEO, you're going to have to trust me. It's this weird combination of sort of arrogance and, dismissiveness that you, I don't need to explain this to you. You need to do what I'm telling you to do. And as a CEO, we convince ourselves that we have the license to do that when in actuality, we really don't. Paper says, yeah, you don't have to explain yourself, but the reality of the world we live in is, no, you need to get buy-in from that manager so she can get buy-in from her staff. And again, so the organization can do what it needs to do. So I will say that in my experience, the hardest thing is to have that awareness of the moment. When you get that question and realize what they're really asking is, listen, I'm struggling with this decision, and I want to know what we're doing. And there's no easy way to get past that. If you are truly pressed for time, to say, hey, listen, I'm glad you asked that question, and I think your opinion's important to me. I'm channeling Quinn Studer. Let's schedule some time to talk about it. But man, you got to really have that sort of emotional awareness to realize what they're really asking you is, I'm not on board. They're communicating to you that I'm not on board. Um, that's that when I hear that story, I'm immediately remembering certain instances that I had, and if I could go back in time, I would do exactly that. Is just to stop, realize what they're really asking me, and then, hey, let's talk about this later. I've got to run to a meeting, but I'm glad you asked me that question. You know,
I think that's the problem. And I think there are probably a lot of healthcare leaders who are listening to this and they're thinking to themselves, wow, if I have to fully explain every answer I provide every day, all day, how am I going to do that? But your point's valid is to try to sift through how important is this? And maybe even that we pause and say, why are you asking this? Can you give me a little bit more context? What concern do you have that has led to this question being asked? And because I think so many times over the years I've assumed I know why they're asking it as
yeah,
opposed to why they're really asking it, because I probably was wrong more often than I was right.
yeah, yeah. And it's again, the guys that are really successful are the ones that know, listen, your opinion, and you're a critical part of this program. I need to make sure you're comfortable with this. And the guys that are good have the ability to know, okay, this is one of those I need to get by in here. And those of us who struggle are the ones who can't pick up on it. And it's that you got to have those little antennas up, and to know what's going on.
And maybe even the right thing to do is to not answer the question in the moment. Um,
Yeah,
does
yeah,
it require an immediate answer? Probably not. Not the examples that we're providing. So, maybe it's a buy yourself a little time to think through, how do I want to respond to this? But it is and you and I talked about this, I think the last episode we recorded together, where I tend to be a higher well, assign responsibility, trust judgment of others and hold them accountable. And you challenge me on that. Where I probably, maybe I swing too far to the side of avoiding micromanagement. And you're not a micromanager, but you are more of a micromanager than I was in my style, and both our styles worked. But maybe I'm too extreme on you know the trust piece. Maybe that's one of my fallacies where I'm willing to trust and figure it out later if I have to, than I should have been as a leader.
Yeah. You just said it. I mean, it's from that dynamic, it's trust. It's okay, do I trust this leader with the information I'm going to give them? Because I'll go back to I want to finish up that example because you asked the question, how do you how do you do this correctly? What's the correct way to do it? And I think a lesson I take away is, well, you know what? If I'm setting out and let's just say I'm starting a new service line, some of us are just like, why do I need to do all this communication and town halls? And that's just going to take time and no one's going to care. They're going to be looking at their phone the entire time. It's a waste of time. I need them doing their job and I got my job to do. But if you do it effectively and you cascade that vision appropriately, it does fix a lot of those things. I mean, you're not going to get stopped in the hallway and you're not going to have staff ask the managers question, well, wait a minute, why are we doing this? And well, how is this going to benefit me? And it sounds like I'm just going to be doing a ton more work and Tom's going to get all the reward for it. You it's yeah, how did you cascade that vision through the organization? Which again, there's an art to that the guys that are successful do it really well.
Yeah, yeah, it's a great point. Well, good. This has been interesting. Good discussion, Paul. Hey,
Yeah, I
I,
don't
I,
want to
I
talk about
guess
my
all the
foot.
well, the listeners are going, well, these two guys hadn't even figured it out yet. And between the two of them, they
Right.
got like 60 years. So,
Yeah. But we can run the list of what not to do.
yeah, absolutely. But I think it goes back to what you and I both know is that your leadership as an individual, you never reach the finish line, in being as good as you can be. You never do. It's impossible. You never reach that point where you are the best leader that you can be. So all you really can do is be self-aware and with intentionality try to do the best that you can, and learn from what works well, learn from what doesn't work well, and just constantly become a little bit better every day. And if you can be the best version of yourself, even though there may be some warts and flaws along the way, you've done your job. So I think
Yeah,
that's the important part is just to continue to grow, continue to develop, and to feel that responsibility for doing so.
absolutely.
Well, thank you, Paul. I appreciate it.
Yeah, man. Thank
All
you.
right.
Enjoy.
Have a great day.
You too.
Thank you for listening to the Karma Leaders Podcast. Please like and subscribe so you don't miss an episode. The views and opinions are only those of the host and guests and are not legal advice.